So we'll kick the meeting off this morning. Welcome to the March meeting of the Project Wildfire Steering Committee. We've got a pretty exciting presentation this morning, or I've been excited about it for a while anyway. So I'm sure a lot of other folks are joining in, really looking forward to it as well. Again, just one last time, reminder, if you don't mind introducing yourself in the chat box. Not only helps us know who's here, but also helps us capture that for the notes. So much appreciated to take a minute or two to put that in the chat box. And with that, I will just we're actually going to dispense with the program updates that we normally do right at the start of the meeting, and we'll catch that after the meeting to take advantage of Yana's time with us here today. So look for that a little bit later in the meeting. And I would like to introduce Yana Valachovic. Yana is joining us from California, where she is the County Director and Forest Advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension, and she covers Humboldt and Del Norte counties, which is quite a territory to cover. So I'm sure she's involved in all sorts of issues down there. But I was listening to the Life with Fire podcast, Yana, and had heard you, when Zeke asked you how you get this information out, you had mentioned that, well, when people invite you to come and present and it works into your schedule, you take people up on that offer. And ever since then, I've been thinking of getting you on there. And then when you showed up on the Fire Adapted Communities Network blog with some really insightful research that you've been involved with, I really excited to look for an opportunity to get you to present some of this information. So Yana's been studying some after fire results and analyzing factors influencing home survival, not only in the Paradise Fire, but apparently in the Marshal Fire as well. So as we're really focused on preventing home loss, this is really a relevant topic for us, and really excited to have Yana join us today. So with that, turn it over to Yana. Thanks again.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I know it's always a little strange to have a Californian drop into Oregon. I am truly a Californian, but I did go to graduate school at Oregon State University. So I've got some Oregon time, and I will say, I'm going to give a compliment. I always have Oregon jealousy. I always feel like, in comparison, that the systems work better in Oregon, that the agencies cooperate better together, and like it's just less difficult. So I'm starting my presentation really from that vantage point, and so it's a real pleasure to be with you all. I'm an extension agent, and I think that's what you call them in Oregon. My technical training is really as a forester. I'm licensed in California. I'm an ecologist, but I'm a lifelong learner. And for those of you who've touched into extension, you know that we cover a million subjects, and we're always moving to new things and trying to be adaptive to what the current challenges are. And a number of years ago, I'll say I lived in Oakland in 1990 during the Oakland Hills Fire. And so I was definitely scarred by that experience. And we started doing some extension programming around how buildings burn, and could never get anybody to show up. I mean, we'd have a few volunteer fire department members and occasionally fire marshal, but people weren't that interested. And I was a real disappointment, because it always seemed like the topic we should be talking about, even though we spent so much time focused on the wildland and what we can do on the wildland side, but like, what is it about the buildings? So it wasn't really until the Tubbs Fire, which is that one in Santa Rosa, that I think sort of galvanized the North State, at least in California, to really be aware of the challenges, that I jumped back in. And I've sort of been in there in full force ever since 2017. And in California, forestry is so much driven by policy. It's really not evidence-based, it's really prescriptive. And so I have this I have this niche where to bring science to management takes a policy change. So I spent a lot of time in our state capitol working with folks to try and make opportunities. So I'm going to give, I think, it feels a little bit like a disjointed talk for me, but I think it would be useful to sort of see where we're at in California and talk. So what I got invited here to do was to talk about the campfire, which has a lot of incredible lessons for all of us. Though I had an opportunity in January to do an evaluation with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, which I think some of you may be aware of the Marshal Fire. So I'm going to talk a little bit about California, a little bit about the Marshal Fire, the majority of my time spending on the campfire itself, and then sort of wrap up as to where we're going and sort of the paradigm and culture shift that we're under. And maybe there's some lessons in there for you all. And I'm getting the sense that there's a lot of quantum change happening in Oregon as well. And so if we can maybe synergize between efforts, I think it would benefit all of us. So I'm a part of the California Fire Science Consortium. There's a consortium in the Pacific Northwest. And so anyway, lots of points to touch in here. You know, what I thought is interesting to share is like California has been in this space of fire and fire prevention for a long time. And I will say that I don't think we got it right. And it's interesting to kind of pivot between conventional and older thinking and current thinking and how you then work within the set of policies and guidance that got developed through time. So, you know, we started in 1965 with the concept of defensible space, and I believe that's something that you all work with. And it was really about the first 30 feet around the building. And so, you know, we had that paradigm, but it's not really until present day do I feel like we're really getting it better. You know, we've been working under a variety of different codes and guidance. So we have something called fire safe regulations that were developed in the 90s. These were really kind of in response to the wildfires that were happening at the time, but it was really around this idea that we should be thinking a little more thoughtfully about where to develop, how to develop, what should development look like, what should be ingress and egress, should there be different standards where we believe there's high fire severity? And I'll show you what we mean by that in California. In 2005, we expanded defensible space out to 100 feet. And when you look at our previous guidance, we just really didn't get it right. And I'll show you what I mean in a minute. Then in 2008, we created exterior building codes, which is known as Chapter 7A, which relate specifically to the exterior envelope and how it can be more resistive to fire exposure. And so when I talk about paradise, I'm going to be basically evaluating the effect of those codes and how well did they perform. And now we're re-evaluating those fire safe regulations around development. We finally created that third defensible space zone, which I know you all have moved into, but we're in the process of really trying to develop what is allowable or unallowable in that first 0 to 5 feet, which I know, you know, lots of folks are talking about nationally, but the devil's in the details. So we're working through it. We're trying to figure out how to get money to communities to do fuel reduction. We're trying to figure out how to get money to communities to do retrofits to existing structures, to be able to do the home hardening and try and figure out how we lift and elevate those communities. So we're largely dependent upon FEMA money for that, which means that we hit a NEPA standard, a National Environmental Policy Act, which gets so much more complicated in that space. And so we've got some big investments right now that are coming through state funds, but whether we'll be able to have sustained effort, I think the jury's still out, but I think we're at least having a better discussion than we've had in a long time. So in California, we divide up the state into, and if you can look on the right, I got to move my viewer here, different colors, as you can see. Green is really the federal lands, and about half of the forest lands are federal in California. But then of the private or state-owned lands, those get color-coded into different fire hazard severity zones, very high, high, and moderate. And we have development restrictions that are based on those fire hazard severities. We're in the process of updating those severity zones right now. And I will say that they're they have some limitations. They're not a perfect science. They're really made to be thinking sort of historically about how fires have behaved and about weather conditions. And, we're in such a rapid period of weather change right now that it feels dated already at this point. And then, we've got a lightning layer that's hard to sort of map and predict. In 2020, our really enormous fires were really contributed by lightning, and they didn't all land on the very high fire severity. Where we tend to get in trouble is really when we have wind. And then we've got multiple ignitions and resources are spread, really thin. And so that's when we lose homes, and that's often when we lose lives. So, using these kind of maps have, a certain purpose, but they don't control everything, and they don't predict everything. So, I think recognizing the limitations of your planning and zoning is important, because a lot of people spend most of their energy focused on this planning and zoning piece. And I think it's a little more complicated than that. So what I mean by sort of our getting it wrong culturally was that when we thought about how people should manage fuels adjacent to their homes or, in their landscapes, we really thought about creating, we called it defensible space, but I will say it's really been about defendable space. And it's this idea that there is always the opportunity for, first responders to be able to get in and defend a home. And so, it was this idea that you modify the vegetation such that a fire will come down from the crown of the tree. So very forest oriented only. These are the graphics we've been using for decades now. Fires were forest fires only. We now know that's really not true. And it was about modifying the fuels such that the fire behavior would change so that the flames would come out of the canopy, come to the ground, and you could put an engine there and defend the home. And that all works when you've got sort of average fire conditions. But when you put wind on it, then you get that long distance transport of embers, and then you can bypass all of those fuel modifications, and you may have such an intense event that you can't put an engine in every home. So as we shift in our awareness towards embers, it requires us to think differently about the vegetation we put next to our homes, how the home envelope itself has been developed, how it can be maintained differently. And I would say that while we've not said it politically, I think we're needing to move to a place where we have prepared essentially for a zero response strategy, meaning that we might not have equipment and resources to be able to be deployed. And that's a hard political muscle to lift. And I think the public is not going to be comfortable with that. But that's, to me, frankly, the reality that we're moving into. And so what can we as, residents, as homeowners, as, leaders in our community do to help ourselves individually and collectively? So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about. While we haven't really, crossed that political landscape and saying that, but I think that's sort of the sober reality of where we're at. So that by backdrop into what I'm thinking about. Now I'm going to go into the campfire itself, and then I'll basically conclude with some insights from the Marshal Fire, which is from a grassland fire, which I think we all could learn from. And then I'll offer some concluding thoughts about where I think our programs are going, and maybe create some conversation around what we're doing here. So the campfire, as you all know, was in 2018. I got to work with some great folks from the Forest Service, and then Dr. Steve Quarles from Cooperative Extension. He also had a role at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and I'm sure you've looked at their resources. They're the facility where you can really test component parts or whole buildings, and have ember exposure in particular to be able to see how buildings themselves perform under those kinds of situations. So great folks. I won't go into lots of detail, but here's a good aerial image of the campfire burning from the east to the west. Probably one of their most tragic events in Western history, with 18,000 plus structures destroyed, 85 people were killed. It was really not a large fire, but a large proportion of the homes were lost in the town of Paradise. But what was really unique about this fire is that it basically was a wind event. It burned in 12 hours and then things stopped. So in terms of a experiment in the sort of scientific frame, we had sort of continuous burn conditions that were held constant. And so we had limited firefighter response. The majority of time was really focused on trying to get people out of harm's way, as it should be. But from a laboratory perspective, it offered a lot of opportunity for learning from this event. I'm now switch perspective. This is the east going to the west on the right. This is at 10:45 in the morning. These are the 3 arteries in town in which you all go out this direction. If you can see my cursor, so you're going to the west. And so the fire started, as we know, it was power line related, wind related, November, and it was, it moved very quickly, it spotted quickly, and it basically overwhelmed the evacuation system in town. So it had a spotting behavior with it, it had an urban fire component associated with it, and it had this horrific wind the whole time. So folks knew that we were going into a red flag warning, and we were expecting winds of relative significance, but I think the part that we couldn't anticipate was really the power line failure at that moment. So I'm assuming you all are talking about power lines these days, but it is a really significant challenge. So for me, I just want to couch kind of how I think about fire exposure, just to be able to interpret the results here. So we partition fire exposure into 3 types. For you, many of you, I'm sure this is for you, but the idea that there's direct flame contact, where you've got a fire that comes from the outside and burns through continuous vegetation and fuels to the home itself, versus this longer distance transport of embers, where you can get firebrands, which are either vegetation related or can be building related or construction related. So once you get an adjacent building ignited, then there are parts of that building that can get lofted in the air column. And those can either land adjacent to the building, or they can land on the building themselves, creating fires in the gutter, or maybe fire on a combustible on a deck, or they can penetrate the vents or an open window or things like that. And then the third component of fire exposure is what we call radiant heat, where you don't actually get ignition on the building. What you do is you get ignition adjacent to the building, either by, like in this illustration, a little outbuilding, a little shed here. It can also be from the vegetation, but you get enough significant heat transfer that it's sufficient to break a window or cause a failure point in some element of the house, and then you can get penetration. So we've been stuck over here in this direct flame contact protection mode, and now our challenge is, how do we look at these 2 other components of embers and radiant heat, both in the envelope of the home itself and in the fuel management adjacent to the building. So given those sort of mechanistic approaches, this is how we came into our study in Paradise. And I'm sure you all have images of your own set related to embers, but they're insidious. They find all the little weak spots in buildings, and they are really capable of finding the spot that you wish no one knew about, where the leaves collect, or where you see the air columns swirl and you've got leaves collecting outside of your building. Well, that's where the embers are going to go. They're going to follow that exact same pattern. But, really, here's the Angora fire in South Lake Tahoe in 2007. And this was a good wake-up call, I think, for us in California, because, it wasn't really until this time that we understood that embers could be such a long-distance transport. And, I kind of look at this like a space alien came down and nanoblasted the house. Like, there's no vegetation engagement in this wildfire, but yet we still have loss of the structure. So what contributed to that? So we are now sort of making that cultural understanding and that shift towards the recognition that you can have this long distance transport that may not carry fire through the vegetation on the way, but we have to think differently here. And within buildings themselves, there are a number of particularly vulnerable locations. So here's a couple illustrations of those, just to make sure we're all sort of on the same page. Where you can have roof to wall intersections, and you've got vegetation accumulated at that wall. And we know that the roof has to carry the lion's share of defense for the structure, and yet you've got a wall that's suddenly being asked to be as strong as the roof. And without modifications to that wall, it can't be. Or the gutters, as I illustrated earlier in that graphic, but this idea that you can get a gutter fire which can go underneath the roof if you don't have a metal drip edge. elements that can really create exposure directly to the building. Or this fence component where you get ignition in a fence and that carries directly to the building itself. This image is from Santa Rosa. And then, just some inside views. This is from the lab at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. But these little, bright lights are basically the embers that are coming in through the screening in the gable end or the under E vents. This is the horizon line. And if there's something that's combustible inside the building, and these embers, get through the screening and land on that combustible material, then you get ignition inside the building. So these are the kinds of ways that in our team that we think about exposures, and we went into our work in Paradise with that framework. So we attempted to answer 3 specific questions. Did proximity to nearby structures factor into the probability of survival? Did the fuel associated with the vegetation factor into the probability of survival? And then what was the effect of the 2008 exterior building code change? Did it increase the odds of survival for those structures? So what we did, this is the town of Paradise. We decided to focus specifically on the single family homes that were built in Paradise. We coded them into 3 periods. Most significant for us was the 2008 to 2018 data set. So that's shown in red. What you can see is that they're not, they're scattered. They're not just in one corner of the community. They really are dispersed around. And so we wanted to look at that decade versus the previous decade before the code change, and then everything older. So that's how we defined our population. We have something called damage inspection data on the damaged homes. There's a post-fire damage analysis that happens that's conducted by a whole variety of folks. It's not one person, so the data quality is good, but there's lots of different people contributing to that. And then from that data, we coded things into destroyed, damaged, like with a window cracked or bubble paint, or no impact. And so we had a robust population of almost 8,000 homes. There's lots of multifamily homes in Paradise. There's lots of trailers as well. And then there are other communities that were impacted, but we decided to make this a doable unit for us. What we ended up doing was subsampling 400 homes, and that's because there's 142 homes that were built after the new construction code. So we randomly grabbed 100 of those, and then we randomly grabbed 100 of the ones that were on the previous decade, and then we grabbed 200 homes from the older ones. You can just see the sort of trends of survival by period, by decade of construction, and I'll tease this apart later, but you can see what we're getting at here. So we're trying to test the effect on either side of the construction code and then look at the older homes. You can already get a sense that there's some fairly strong evidence to what we're talking about, but there was no pre-data for this area, so we were limited to what we could use by a lot of remote techniques. So we looked at overstory canopy cover, visually estimated in so here's the subject building, in a 30 meter radius and 100 meter radius. And then we measured the distance to the nearest destroyed structure. So here's our subject structure, and then we measured the distance to the nearest destroyed building or survived building, regardless of whether it was a home. So we looked at garages, outbuildings, all that kind of stuff. That's all from imagery from Google Earth. We have no understory cover data available to us, so there's a limitation in what we can say about surface fuels. We looked at lot size, then we looked at land use characterization, and so you've got the interface versus the intermix. So intermix is more residential, and then we also looked at slope. So there are things you could call foul with us that you would wish we had more information about, but this is what we could work with. And what I'll say is that the older homes were not exactly the same as the newer homes. The older homes were on smaller lots, so they were on basically 3/4 acre lots versus 1 1/4 acre lots on the newer homes. The older homes had higher density and had more canopy cover. So, they were built during a different time. A lot of the homes were built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. This was a retirement community, not a wealthy retirement community. It's a place that you and I would all probably want to live, that you would find quite enjoyable and quite beautiful. But with time, you get more canopy cover. You maybe clear a lot to build a house, and then vegetation comes in and trees grow and those kinds of things. So there is something that's a little bit different about those older homes than the newer homes. And I think what was interesting here, I'm going to go through a bunch of data and then I'll summarize this to make it make sense here, is that land use and canopy cover in that first 30 meters really were not significant predictors in our analysis of variance, where a bunch of our other variables were, and I'll explain that in a minute. So we didn't have we didn't know what we'd find. We actually did not think we'd find statistical trends. We thought it'd be pretty messy. And we used something called decision tree analysis, if you're familiar with this, where you basically put all the data in and then the computer does some very complicated computation, and it sort of makes a pathway and tries to make sense of what we're seeing in terms of probability survival. And what surprised us is that we got a really strong message out of it. And when you think about it, it really does make some sense. So one of our research questions was, did the proximity to nearby structures factor into the probability of survival? And I'll explain it through this decision tree in a minute. And the answer is yes. So if you were less than 18 meters away from a nearest destroyed structure, you had a much greater chance of survival. So, no, I didn't say that right. If you were greater than 18 meters away, you had a much better chance of survival. So that's about 54 feet. And so this idea that a 50-foot separation between a building that's lost and a building that survives, that's sort of the mark of change there. There's some more work going on right now. Some of that's through IBHS, some of it's through NIST, trying to really look at the structure separation piece. From an extension point, we're generally talking about 25, 30 feet as the number. So I'm not highly attached to this number, but this idea though that the condition of your neighboring building had an effect on your building, I think that makes a lot of sense. So then in the decision tree, what was the next split? So did the fuel associated with nearby vegetation factor into the probability? And the next split was on canopy cover. So if the homes were greater than 18 meters and had less than 50% canopy cover in the 30 to 100 meter category, the probability of survival increases to 48%. So there's a strong relationship essentially in your neighborhood effect and if there's vegetation. And so this is a landscape that I didn't describe very well. It's ponderosa pine with black oak, and then some other landscape related trees that people plant. There's a strong overstory of that ponderosa pine. It's quite tall. And so what I think is happening is that you get contributions of needles and leaves and cones and other things that continually provide fuels, both as surface fuels to carry the fire and as those that accumulate on the building. So there's a relationship basically to a little bit greater density. And then we found an additional relationship sort of pre and post 1973, and then sort of a weak one associated with slope. So what I really want to emphasize here is that there is a signature associated with the community effect, both in the buildings and the tall vegetation here. We also looked at the damaged buildings and looked at sort of a whole lot of that data set. And what we see is something really interesting. So again, just sort of a visual to kind of reinforce like that Angora fire image I showed you a while ago from Tahoe. I mean, what we saw here is that, this wasn't a crown fire. These are the ponderosa pine trees and other trees that are in the area. Where you see damage to the trees is really adjacent to where we have loss of the buildings. And so, you get, a heat effect on the adjacent vegetation when those buildings ignite. And so we'll make some kind of punchy statements that really, the amount of the fuel is really in our built environment in some respects more so than in our wildland environment. And so this issue of radiant heat. So, once you get ignition in one building, how does that, have a neighborhood or adjacency effect is really pronounced in the damaged buildings. So when we went back and looked at all the damage data and categorized them, we saw that radiant heat contributed to 63% of the damage overall in those surviving but damaged buildings. And the fire damage clause was largely related to windows and exterior walls, as you would expect, being driven by radiant heat. So, just a few more images of kind of this neighborhood effect where, you can see a block get taken out, but then there can be a core that's protected. So if something was right in these buildings that, it made them able to withstand sort of the exposure of these adjacent buildings. So in thinking about that, what's the appropriate density? There's a lot of great questions, a lot of land use questions that come from this. But let's talk about, before we get to that, sort of the effect of this new building code change. And what I'll show you was a bit of a surprise, I will say. So basically, these older buildings, they survive at about 11% overall. And, we don't know anything about them. We don't know whether they're still holding on to their original roofs. We don't know their maintenance condition. We don't know how much stuff is accumulated outside their properties. The longer you live someplace, the more stuff you get. We don't know anything about that, but those older buildings certainly have more potential vulnerabilities given their age and given that people have probably lived in them for a longer amount of time. But I think what surprised me is that we didn't see a statistical effect between the construction code window of 2008 to 2018. But we do see significant increasing trends in survival in these newer buildings. And to me, that makes a lot of sense because, buildings that are 20 years old are still in their period of performance respective to the roofing. We've moved largely to double pane windows, which have more resistive power than single pane windows. Clearly tempered glass makes a significant difference, and that's not required in the codes. There are places and room for modification in these older homes, but they are statistically greater than the decade before the construction codes. The 97 to 2007 buildings are statistically significantly better than these older homes themselves. So what does it all mean? And here's kind of what we concluded here is that when it comes to the vegetation, higher survival was associated with lower overstory tree cover in that 30 to 100 meter zone. Here's an image that I took just this year, and it was on the same day that the fire ignited, and you can see the contribution of litter that was being senesced at this point, and then you add high wind on top of that, and there was a lot of stuff surface fuels to carry the fire. But that influence we call the term indirect, creating indirect potential ignitions. We didn't see much evidence of continuity of wildland fuels to homes. And that I'll show you also in the Marshal Fire. Now, the other thing is that these homes that were built in 2008 were not subject to our new 0 to 5 zone. And so we had a lot of continuity of fuels that's basically adjacent to the buildings. And that hopefully will be changing with the new state policies. So we think that that will make a significant improvement. And then let me just bring forward the limitation in that we don't really know what the pre-fire surface fuel data was like. We just don't have access to a data set. There isn't one to provide that. But when it comes to the built environment piece, this idea that the total number of destroyed structures within 100 meters and the distance to the nearest destroyed structure were the strongest predictors, that says, we're kind of in this together and we really need to help us all elevate our, pre-fire work that we can do on our built environment as well as in our vegetation. We know that Chapter 7A, which is that construction code, has room for modifications, and the good news is that there's a whole team that's working on that, and I think we've demonstrated clearly that radiant heat is important, and there's room for change in that radiant heat piece. I talked about this earlier, this idea that construction standards and materials are making a difference, this idea that roofing has a long service life. But I just want to say maintenance is key. Just because you buy the product doesn't mean it was installed correctly or that it's been maintained well. And then, you know, basically our study also has lower density conditions, probably more similar to, you know, some of your rural communities in Deschutes County. But the challenge clearly is once homes engage, density does matter. So that is where a lot of people are having fun with this study, trying to get to some policy conclusions out of it, which may or may not be appropriate. So that's Paradise. I think I'd like to roll and just show you some of the stuff in Marshall, and then open for conversation, if that's all right. Everyone needs a stretch. Hope you're doing okay. You know, it's always a little weird to get talked at, but it's best we can do here. So this is the Marshal Fire. It kicked off December 30th. It was a one-day fire. It was in a grassland community on the backside of the mountains. It hit these sort of dense communities as shown here. That's the fire burning through. I went out with a bunch of folks from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And what we were after was really looking at the transition between damaged and destroyed homes, trying to figure out if there was something that we could predict that explained, you know, why one building survived and one did not. We were after looking at pathways for fire spread from the wildland to homes. And here's an example of fire basically, you know, came from this direction, which is the west to the east, and there was grassland. And then it encountered a row of homes. So what happened here? That's the question we were after. And we worked with Wildfire partners, and we were fortunate to have a number of conversations with homeowners and neighbors to get some more detailed predictions of, or detailed understanding of what the sequencing of events were. And this is just a map of the fire perimeter, and the arrows in purple are where we went, and the red are lost homes. There's about 1,000 lost homes. The yellow are damaged homes. And just for context, you know, just to sort of look at, you know, what this world looked like. You know, you can see that there was a lot of grassland, but it really wasn't a forested or tree canopy environment. So what did we see? Well, a couple more things. Just to remember that we had gusts over 115 miles per hour. It burned about 6,000 acres, and it was the change in weather and the snowfall that put the fire out. And over 1,000 homes were lost. So I've just got a series of little case studies to show you. This is one example of new construction, and this is basically these condos were built in, I think, 2000 or 2001. Firefighter response, it contributes to their saving. They made a line with this walking path, and they were determined to hold it. The fire got here 6 o'clock-ish, and the wind stopped at 8. So the contribution of firefighter response and change in wind were really important to these buildings' survival. But there's some nice illustration of how materials matter here. So the way the code works in Colorado, these sliding glass doors that go out onto these little patios were made of tempered glass, but the daylight windows on the top here were all annealed glass. And so you can see that the annealed glass failed from the radiant heat exposures from these adjacent buildings burning. We also had a lot of vinyl siding. We had some vinyl melting. Oh, we had vinyl, yeah, that's right. We had vinyl shutters that melted on the inside. Just some interesting illustrations of, you know, how performance works in these cases. The door had their glue oozing out from the heat exposure. But, you know, this rock facade definitely helped in general. But I just thought you'd like to see sort of how windows perform kind of in a side-by-side comparison. This is a fairly typical neighborhood that had loss. You know, we were curious what contributed to the loss of these homes versus these over here. You know, what were some of the elements of that transition? They're all, in this case, these are late 80s, 90s subdivisions. So a variety of different siding, generally tempered, double pane windows, those kinds of things. And what we heard from the community was it was really about fences. And what we had ignition in dry grass. We had fire carried in dry grass or spot fires in dry grass. And then here's a fence coming along the top here, as I'm showing. And what probably happened, even though there's rock mulch on this side, is that there was something, leaf material or something from the landscape trees that accumulated at the base of the fence, and we had ignition, and that created ignition in the fence, and that could bring the fire basically directly to the house. Here's kind of another example of that, where you can see ember distribution. We didn't have surface fire carry across this grassland, but you can see the damage on the fences here. So this fence relationship was really, to me, really important in this fire. And here's just some more examples. In both of these cases, we had firefighter response, but you can see there was grass over here. We had carry of fire to the fence, and then the fence started burning coming this direction. A lot of retaining walls here too. We had fire in those retaining walls, and then attachment of the fence to the retaining wall, and then we had ignition and fence. So pathways are important and sometimes difficult to see. Here's another example. This is a golf course on the right-hand side. This is, again, late 80s, many homes that are stucco. They also have these sort of stucco wrapped walls. They're wood structured underneath. And in this case, we had embers deposited on the grass in the golf course, burning behind this wall. Material caught at the base here. They have a little fence, little metal mesh screen, and ignition basically in the fence and bender board carried the fire directly this way, and then the fence attached to this house. We had ignition in that fence, and then we had penetration in the house in the under eave area right here. So this is that kind of fun forensic detective work that the IVHS and other folks do. I'm sure your fire marshal folks around the call understand what I'm talking about. Here's, just there was firefighter response in this case. That's what preserved this building, and that's why we don't have a complete loss of the whole structure in this particular case. So, just important to kind of see these patterns. On the other side of the house, there were multiple points of penetration on this home. What surprised me was this is what we would typically call that first 0 to 5 zone. It's only probably 2.5, 3 feet here. They use a lot of rock mulch, and typically you would see ignition in maybe wood mulch at the base, and then that would create significant surface fire to be able to get ignition in the vegetation. In this case, because we had such strong wind distribution, this kind of conifer, which is a decorative conifer, it sheds a lot of dead material and then keeps it in its canopy. And so we actually had ignition without the surface fire here. That burning of this conifer led to, again, under eave penetration and ignition into the attic. You can see another example of this woody shrub, and we took this vent off, and I can tell you that we had flames that were forcing on the underside of the foundation and the crawl space here. So this is really kind of changing our tune and how we're in California thinking about what could be allowable here, and really focusing on this idea that no woody vegetation should be allowable in this zone. Lots of wind, so you can see garbage cans were blowing over, so material from the garbage cans was lodged everywhere. And, I'll just say that assembly really matters, how the building is constructed. Here's an example. I'm back on that same building, but while this building is stucco, the assembly is interesting, because when you look at the base right down here as it attaches to the perimeter foundation, you can see that there's a unprotected fiber-based sheathing in the exterior wall. Here's a little illustration of it. So had we got ignition basically at the base of this wall, we had a fully vulnerable, unprotected component that could have basically allowed fire to bypass the structure of the stucco and get behind and into the subcavity in the wall. So, stucco is not stucco. It's all constructed slightly differently. And so it's important to understand, where those vulnerable locations are, and to try and mitigate those to the best of people's abilities, or design them well from the beginning. Also, the under eave area was basically a fiber-based composite, both the fascia and the eave, and that's how we got ignition into that under eave area. So, the details matter. And, I'll conclude here with an example. This is on one of the homes that got, or one of the communities that got exposed first. There were, I think, 17, 15, something like that, homes in this subdivision. This was the last one to be built. It's the only one that survived. We believe there was no firefighter response. And, here's an example of an adjacent building that was lost. There's one right over here. They did a super good job. I mean, there's so many things that are right on this building. It's just a real pleasure to see that, a lot of these non-combustible walkways, they did have vegetation, but it was well confined into these nice planters that were generally made of something that was non-combustible. The embers and the first fire exposure were coming from downhill up to this building. So it's great to see. And then we wrapped around the front side, and the entryway is a little bit like an alcove. And to much to our surprise, the building had actually had quite a bit of fire. So there's a little bear, and you can see ignition at the base of the bear. We can see ignition at the base of the door. And then just to the right of the door is this planter bed, and there was some woody vegetation in here. And we've got a window pane breakage, at least first pane, not full loss. And we actually had a fairly significant fire here in the front of the alcove. So, our messaging in California is really that it matters on all sides of the building. You can't just have one little area that's maybe a little bit different than the rest of the building. Like, it all has to work together. So I don't know, I use this as a sign of optimism that, if you put all the pieces together, you really can, under what an extreme wildfire, have a surviving building. And that's just, I think it's exciting to see the parts come together. So in conclusion, wooden fences were really an important factor. Combustibles in the first 5 feet were observed in location. We ended up with direct flame contact. We talked about the details mattering with the stucco and the construction of the fascias and the eaves, where you've got combustible materials there that can be problematic. And in our case, we really didn't see an effect, aside from that last example of where the building itself performed on its own. Really, we saw it was the locations where either community members, first responders, or firefighters were able to make a stand and make a difference and basically prevent further spread of the fire. So in wrapping up here, I'll just say that, in California, just the last couple of thoughts here, we are not proponents of plant lists. I don't know where you all stand on that issue. We're really more about plant placement than plant type, and we've got a good study that goes into the effects of evaluating plants and why it's so difficult to create a plant list. So if that's something that's interesting to you, happy to make this talk available to you all, and you can look into that. Just this idea that plant condition changes through time, and it's really a lot about maintenance more than the plant itself. And, we've got a lot of work in on sort of the home hardening priorities. And if you're still working in that space, we've got stuff to share. I think we talked some yesterday about the Tahoe publication, which does a nice job expressing this. But, this idea of, when the buildings are far apart, here's how you sort of rank them. When they get closer together, there's sort of additional issues. And I think, the study in Paradise really showed this issue of once the neighborhoods densify, kind of what that exposure is from one building to the next. And, I'll conclude by saying, I think there's a lot of reason for hope. And there's, I think there's a lot of parts that are coming together in terms of our cultural understanding, in terms of the products that are available to us. And, there are examples of making a difference that are great to learn from. And I've got many others from other fires in California. What's interesting is that we fight fire, just when you sort of think about it kind of intellectually, but we don't fight earthquakes or tornadoes or hurricanes. We essentially have decided that we can't fight that, right? What do? Well, we adapt and we build smarter. And I think that's in part what we need to do when it comes to fire. We know that there's a lot we can do in the broader landscape and how we can make forests more resilient and bring the intentional use of fire back to be able to manage fuels and really thin for resiliency and grow more resilient trees. but it's really us that's in the way, and us that are really struggling in this space. So I'm hopeful that when we start focusing in on the home piece, that can give a little breathing room to the forests themselves. And in California, we're struggling because we don't have unified messaging and alignment around these issues. And so we've had to change policy to be able to have our state agencies be in that space of unified messaging. And I think it's exciting to see how our construction codes are performing, but it doesn't deal with our existing homes. And so how do we retrofit and create incentives for retrofitting those existing homes? That's going to be a heavy lift, but to me, clearly we have to do it. And then I'll just share from vocabulary. You're welcome to any of our materials related to the kinds of graphics we're using. Our state agency responsible for fire is CAL FIRE, which used to be known the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. And they requested that first 0 to 5 feet be called zone 0. So we are going to have zone 0, 1, 2, not 1, 2, 3, because we already had existing zones 1 and 2. And I'll conclude by, here's sort of the pieces of resiliency that I think about. And we talked today a little bit about wildland management, mostly about fire resilient homes, but there are so many dials to turn respective to adaptation and resiliency. And for me, we got to turn all of them simultaneously. And it's not just one simple solution. It's going to take multi-pronged solutions and a capacity for us to work together and really do integrated planning and break down the silos between organizations. And public health has a big role to play in all of this. Air quality is significant. How we protect infrastructure, all of these sort of meaty challenges. And I'm hopeful that we can start to see this as, it's not just a chronic issue anymore, it's really an acute one, and we all have to work together in this space. So I've probably exceeded my time, but I am happy to answer questions and look forward to learning from you all. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Yana. And yeah, we do have time for some questions, discussion. If folks have some, I'd be surprised if we have none. But great presentation, lots of things to think about. Looks like Greg's got his hand up, so we'll turn over to Greg, who's a resident in one of our communities just outside of Bend.
Yeah, well, I've got several questions, but I'll go with one first. I was just wondering, did you have a lot of pushback on changing these codes with like real estate agencies or with the builders associations?
The building codes or the defensible space codes?
Probably building codes.
No, we're actually doing pretty well. I think we've got agreement in California on new construction. That's, I think, the easy one. The harder one is what to do with existing construction. We're about to roll out the zone 0, that first 5 feet, and I think we're going to get ripped apart in California. I think people, because it will apply to everybody, and it won't just be new construction. That's where I think we're going to have some significant upheaval.
Okay, another question. Okay, pertaining to that, how are you guys looking at incentivizing people to do that on the existing homes?
That's what I was saying earlier, that at this point, there's not a lot of state money that's being put into that space. We're mostly reliant on federal money through FEMA. And, that's what I'm hopeful is that we can stay the course, because just a little infusion is not going to be sufficient. And to me, how do we identify the most vulnerable? How do we identify those that have financially the least available? The elderly, those that have some, more challenge than other folks. So, these are going to be hard questions. We're going to work through it, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Okay, thanks.
You bet.
Jane.
I think she might need to be unmuted.
There we go.
Hi, there, I got it. Hi, thanks. I'm Jane Killifer, Tollgate Firewise Chair and Tollgate Property Owners and Sisters, Oregon. Great presentation. Big picture question. We're trying to get details about the new Oregon Senate bill that was passed so that we could give a a quick question and answer for our residents. Is that something that is done already? I can't find it.
I could probably take that one. This is not exactly, it's related in that we are undergoing a lot of these things that Yana is referring to in Oregon as well. But Senate Bill 762 is kind of still under development and rulemaking. So when we get to that point, I am hoping that we can host an informational session and or Project Wildfire presentation on the details of that as they become a little bit more apparent.
And that would get notified through this group?
We will try to get something in our newsletter at the very least, if not actually hold a meeting on it, if there's not a separate meeting or multiple separate meetings, as there's multiple agencies involved in rolling out those rules. And I expect that to be a little closer to final later in the summer and into the fall as the defensible space and building codes get finalized in anticipation of a deadline at the first of the year.
Okay, great. And thank you. My second question is just an announcement. Tollgate on May 7th, we'll be having a Firewise rally, just kick off our cleanup. So some of you already know about it and some of you will be getting emails from me. So we're looking for representation from any and all.
Great, thank you. Couple questions in the chat. I don't know if you're watching those, Yana, but just related to availability of your presentation. Of course, we recorded this and this will be posted as part of our meeting materials, but if you are open to it, we would also love to include in our meeting minutes or notes your presentation for folks to kind of review, because there's a lot of details in some of those slides that I'm sure people didn't get to dig into. Is that all right?
I'm happy to make those available. Just watch the photo credit stuff. I'm careful to make sure that IDHS gets the photo credit where they're the contributing photographer, and if there's no name on it, then those are all my photos.
Great, thank you. And then before we get to a couple other folks that have their hand up in the chat, I think before anybody else had their hand up, any insight onto vinyl siding versus wood siding?
It melts.
Yeah.
It melts.
Usually backed by wood too, so.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I'm not, wood is not the issue. It's really about how we treat it, how we care for it, and how we protect it. And, there are vulnerabilities that wood have, but if we treat it poorly, then it's going to have poor performance. But if we can put that first 0 to 5 around the decks, around the buildings, then you're not likely not to have direct flame contact on the siding or on the deck itself, and that'll make the difference. I think about there's a book called Merchants of Doubt, and I don't know if you know why we ended up with fire retardant chemicals in our beds, and that was because we were having fire and people when they were sleeping because they were smoking. And so instead of changing the behavior of the smoker, we changed the condition of the bed. So I think of in this case that the wood is like the bed, and we either change behavior and protect that wood and do it well, or we end up basically not being able to build with wood anymore. And so that's to me really problematic because using wood from a climatic benefit is really an important thing that we need to be considering. So decisions, what we choose to build with, how we choose to build, they're multifaceted. It's not a single answer in all these situations, but I hope we can consider fire in some of the decision making a little better than we have in the past.
Great. Ray Meow, who, and just by means of introduction, Ray comes off mute. Ray's a resident of one of our Firewise communities and a board member of one of our fire districts as well.
Thank you, Yana. Great presentation. Question for you. Do you have any messaging that seems to resonate with homeowners and getting them to really clean or remodel their 0 to 5 feet, the zone 0?
Yeah.
And can we get a copy of it?
Well, I mean, I think to me, I start talking about personal responsibility and this idea of what are you going to regret later, and these are things you can't retrofit, you can't deal with in the moment. Yes, you can rake if you have the opportunity to, to have some awareness that a fire is coming your direction. But what we have seen between Santa Rosa and the Camp Fire is that people had no warning, right? They evacuated either in the middle of the night or with the idea that there was fire all around them. There was no chance to basically do the stuff you'd want to do in 6 hours. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So we now have very clear evidence throughout California and into Washington and Oregon that this stuff really matters. And we, developed our homes during a condition and a paradigm thinking that is very different than the present reality that we're in right now. So what can we do to help ourselves? And I just try and say that instead of relying upon others, don't you want to know some of the tools that are going to make a difference for you and your family? Because these are things that are that are achievable. They're mostly related to a little bit of sweat equity. And, I think communities can band together and bring their talents, and, maybe someone's got a strong back and someone's got great vision, and, you mesh those together and you can really, I think, redesign a landscape that's going to work for the future. And adaptation and resiliency require that.
Thank you.
A couple more hands up. Gary, I see you don't have your hand up, but you're off mute. Did you have anything to share before I move on to a couple other folks?
Yeah, I had a question for Yana, and that is, as we know internationally, that most of the people that perish in these wildland fires, the majority of them, overwhelmingly majority, are dying from trying to escape the fire. And if we build these communities the way that we all feel we should, and with the codes in place, and of course, if you have codes, you have to have inspections and you have to have political will to have those inspections done. Has your group, as your colleagues, started talking about protecting in place? So when we do not have that escape route, that if we do have these built communities, in the proper fashion, that we can start protecting within our homes.
Yeah, I think it's a great comment. I know that our agencies are not comfortable with that conversation from a liability perspective, but to me, I think information is power. And the point being that you don't want to wait to the last second, because that is the worst thing you can possibly do. But I think what we've clearly seen in Paradise and in Santa Rosa is that people did not have time, and the alert systems have not worked. We have like 25 different alert systems in California, and we have lots of visitors, and if you suddenly need to trigger an alert in the middle of the night, you may or may not get that alert. And that's what happened in Paradise's case. People didn't get alerts and didn't have the capacity to evacuate. So I think to me, I feel like it's a moral responsibility to increase people's understanding of what fire behavior is likely to be, where you can be safe, how to protect your airway. I mean, do we want to listen to another story of someone trying to shelter in a pool with a straw? Right? It's our airways that are what make us so vulnerable. So, for me, we're not targeting it directly, but if anyone asks me, I tell them what they're likely to experience and what a safe location might look like and what it means to be properly prepared for that moment. And what it means not to be. And so, for homeowners and community members that are unwilling to make transitions in their home condition, I encourage them to leave early and understand that a red flag warning may be the time that you need to leave. And yes, we experience lots of them, but that's what survival is going to look like for you. I don't know. I think we kind of have to push the hard sell here and really explain to people that their survival is tenuous in this space unless we really behave and perform differently. In Paradise, they did have one community where they knew there was a pinch point on the road, and so they mowed a section where they could stage cars. And so there was some success in that case where people did stage there and then drove their vehicles back and forth between the burned and unburned areas to shelter. That's a little dicey to me, but how do we think about our areas that we irrigate? Like, are there other places that can be staging grounds? Are there other buildings that can be designed well that can make a difference? If you guys figure it out, let me know.
It's a tough one. Maybe one more question from Dean, and then we'll need to move on to a couple other items.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. In some of the rural areas here, most of the properties I think are ½ acre or 1 acre, and a lot of times we find out a property owner does whatever they can for to protect their own property, and then they become more concerned about their neighbor's property. So we've been mostly telling people, just concentrate on your own property, do everything you can, and you're going to have a better chance. But in your analysis, how much vulnerability do they have from adjacent properties? I know you covered it, and you were talking about so many meters and stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I'm an extension agent, and so I believe my message generally should be empowering, solution-oriented, and motivational. So what I just shared with you is a little bit complicated, and I find, and I'll just use my family as an example. My mother, who I love dearly, loves to find fault in others around her. And she usually talks about fuels and vegetation condition on the neighbor's property first. She's not going to look at her own house. And so I think what I try and do is really explain, do what you can to take care of what you can yourself. That's the first level of responsibility, right? We get trained when we go down an airline, right? Secure your own mask first before you take care of others. It's sort of the same framework in my mind, that we need to take care of our stuff at home, and then we need to show by example and really show that it's possible. And then we need to work together. But yes, there is some vulnerability in your neighborhood's condition. And, I think we can't escape that. But the more we do on our own place, the better off we can. If we can, prevent that pathway of direct ignition to our buildings from our neighbors, if we can really shore up, the exterior perimeter of our properties, that all makes a difference. What the quantitative difference is, I mean, it's hard to predict because you don't know which direction the fire is going to be coming from. You don't know what the fire weather behavior will be that day. I mean, there's a lot of variables in there, but take care of your stuff that you can, and then be the shining example in the neighborhood, so that everybody wants to go, well, what are you doing there? What was that about? Huh, that's different. Huh, I didn't know what that was. And then you have the opportunity to explain it, and then they go, that's a good idea. Let's do that, right?
Thank you.
All right, with that and a glance at the time, I think we will wrap up this portion of the meeting. But Yana, thank you so much. I know it's a little unusual for an Oregon group to be requesting a California extension agent, but the research is just and some of your insight is really so relevant, especially as for us, we're moving into our fire season and offering times during our events called Fire Free to do some of this work. So I think it's a good reminder and lots of good insights, and really appreciate your time this morning and your time putting together the presentation for us.
You're welcome. And I hope to invite you guys down and we can learn from all the great work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you. And of course, you're welcome to stay. Don't feel compelled. Okay. All right, we will turn it over to Boone for a quick program update. And just a reminder, if y'all took a look at the notes and have any questions or corrections, send them our way. Otherwise, Boone, take it away with a few program updates, and we'll roll into Roundtable for those that have updates.
Okay. Yeah, I'll keep it as short as I can and direct to the point. So we're what you got on the screen right now are kind of the bigger ticket items that we're working on right now. So the Greater Redmond CWPP is under the revision process. So we're gathering all the input right now from accomplishments, and we'll begin to, I guess we've already begun to formulate the revised plan. So as that comes out, we'll continue to update that. There is I've sent out several times the CWPP story map, and if you scroll through that, down near the bottom, there is a link to subscribe to the updates if you aren't already on the email list and receiving those from me. Fire Free, we did set those dates, kind of sitting on a news release, we're kind of finalizing a couple pieces of Fire Free, but we are looking at the not landfill running April 30th through the May 15th, and the transfer stations doing that May 21st through June 4th. Shared that last month, but I think it's worth reiterating and make sure everybody hears it so they can plan around those dates. We're looking at defensible space classes. Ed and I have been in conversations talking about what dates to set for classes that we open to pretty much everyone. So hopefully we'll still be, we're hoping to have those out shortly. Sometime April is when we're looking at having those classes, and more to come on when that does happen. I'm not going to dive too far into Firewise. We continue to work on those communities and kind of work through with folks. Very vital piece of the program, but I'm not going to get into too many specifics. I think we've got approximately 3 communities offer for assessments over the next few weeks here. But continuing with that. If there's anything I missed, Ed, you're welcome to jump in there.
I think that's the bulk of it. I would just note, after quite a significant effort of our most recent FEMA grant, a good portion of that was completed at Eagle Crest. That project is about 85% complete, not fully complete, as we have some slash disposals to complete next fall, winter. But after a real significant effort up there at the Rigid Eagle Crest, really excited to see that project come to fruition as we approach our cutoff date, which is actually today to stop working. So I'm really glad to see that project getting done. And I know, in relation to Firewise and communities and Fire Free, a lot of you are planning your work that was funded through our discretionary lottery grants. It was funded at $100,000 across, I think, 33 communities. So really excited to see y'all pulling off those projects as well. So with that, before we move into the rest of the partner roundtables, any questions for Boone on the things we covered? Okay, then I am going to move right to a partner I know kind of pinged us yesterday or the day before on an update they would like to share. So Robert, if it's not catching you too much by surprise, Robert Dewey, I know you had an update, and that we'll kind of go. If folks want to either raise their hand or let me know after that, we'll try to just hit the folks that have updates.
Yeah, Thank you. I'll just share my screen really quickly.
Boone's going to have to stop sharing there. There we go.
Perfect. All right, let me know if you can all see that. All right, so I just wanted to let you all know about some future projects that we are working on, mostly in the South County area. If everybody doesn't know me, I'll introduce myself. I've been on a number of these meetings already. I'm Robert Newey. I am the fire management officer here in Bend, on the Bend Fort Rock Ranger District, Newberry Division. And but I wanted to reach out to this group, and then I plan to reach out to the UDRC group as well. And the intent is to really just share some information and then seek a little bit of feedback, positive or negative, related to these 3 projects that we're planning. So all these locations are kind of right down in South County. It's kind of hard to see on this map, but I'll zoom in on the next couple slides. But one of them is Oregon Water Wonderland area. Next one is Forest Lane, and the next one is Fall River Estates area. And so the intent, and I'll just dive right in, the intent is really to identify areas that we can provide some fuels treatment work and work through a collaborative process with the local communities and the homeowners, and really provide a benefit addressing fuels concerns in some areas. These fuel CEs are capped at 3,000 acres. All these three specific projects are are much smaller than 3,000 acres. So diving into the first one, we're looking at Oregon Water. Here's the first one, and we'll zoomed in. Oregon Water Wonderland, Forest Lane, and then Fall River Estates. Oregon Water Wonderland is really, it's just shy of 40 acres, 38 acres total. It's a little inholding. If you're not familiar with it, it's a little inholding of Forest Service land surrounded by private land. The Deschutes River runs right on the west side of it. And the intent, again, is to reduce fuels. Currently, it's a ponderosa pine overstory with dense lodgepole understory growing up in, and so really the intent is to go in there, treat that area, and reduce those hazardous fuels concern and potential of fire spread through that area. We do pick up a number of fire starts seasonally through there. It's typically human caused, and the threat primarily is from human. And our concern is those starts occurring within the forests and then moving out into the public space, or into the I should say the private space adjacent to that area. So as you can see, this little zoomed in of the community itself. All those little dots are homes, and the river is unfortunately not included on this map, but it's right along that west side of that 40-acre parcel. Moving on, and I'll take questions afterwards unless there's popping up. But moving on, Forest Lane. So Forest Lane, a little bit larger area. This is the intent is to really focus in on ingress and egress. And if you're not familiar with this area, this is right across from Big River Group Site Camp, and right on the Deschutes River as well. They really have a one primary ingress egress route to their community, and the intent is really to reduce those fuels surrounding that area and along the western boundary of their community. Again, the river is not included on this, but it does run just a little bit on the east side of this community, right along here. So this 210 road is the primary route in and out, and it would be really focused in on providing mowing and repeat entry of mowing when desired and when needed. So there'd be no burning in here, but it would be repeat mowing in there to address the brush, really to break up that continuity of fuels and provide firefighters an opportunity to kind of stop those, or be a little more successful with new starts. Moving on, the next one is Fall River Estates, and this is a little bit bigger project. It's about 1,100 acres, and it's really surrounding on the north and kind of on the south side of Fall River Estates. And as I'm sure a number of folks here are well aware, Fall River Estates is on both sides of Fall River, and this would be addressing a lot of the Forest Service lands. As you can see, or before I jump into there, what we're looking at doing, purpose and need, is really creating creating an opportunity for discontinuity in the fuels. So breaking up those fuels so that when we get a fire in there, it doesn't rapidly move through. We also want to create an opportunity for ponderosa pine to take a more dominant footprint in there. It is predominantly a ponderosa pine overstory, but a lot of lodgepole encroachment there. Some concerns in there that we have are it's obviously a wildlife, high use wildlife area, I believe elk calving area, and then also riparian area. right along the river. And so some of those would be some of the constraints that we're working within. But again, we'd be looking at thinning, gravel piling, hand piling, and then pile burning and prescribed fire across this project area, along with massification. And then, of course, repeat entries. And so zoomed in a little bit closer, you can see, of course, the dots are the private structures. The multiple colors here indicate the previous projects that have gone in through here. It has not been a holistic approach across the addressing all the Forest Service land. And of course, this is checkerboarded with BLM, private Forest Service. And so what we're really looking at doing is really treating these fuels and setting the neighborhood up for a little bit more resilience to confront fire. This would couple, and it's not on this map, but this would couple nicely with a new project that's coming on board called the 42 project, and that is bounded right on the north side of the 42 road, and between the 4230, it comes down and then bumps back up. Or actually, I'm sorry, it keeps on going out the 42 road, then down to the Fall River Guard Station, and then back north. That is a separate project that is currently going on the, or will be coming on board soon. So I know that was pretty quick, and I'm happy to address questions here. I know we're short on time, but if you do have questions and you don't want to chat in this format, feel free to reach out to me. There's my phone number and my email address, and I'd be certainly happy to chat directly one-on-one or in a group format. So thanks for giving me a little bit of time, Boone, Ed.
Thanks, Robert. Any real quick questions for Robert? Otherwise, I'd encourage you all to follow up with any more details you're interested in. Dean, I figured you'd have one, being resident out there in the Fall River area.
Yeah, yeah, these are our neighborhoods. I just wanted to thank you, Robert. We've gotten a lot of concern over the past few years about these areas, and so much appreciated.
Thank you, Dean.
Okay, with that, any other updates? We still have 5 or 6 minutes for any other partner updates if we don't have any questions for Robert. And I'm not going to necessarily go on down the list, but if you want to just come off mute or raise a hand, either way works. We don't have too large of a group where we can be pretty informal about any updates we want to share. Ross, maybe?
Hey, Ed, I do have an update. So I'll just kind of give you an update where ODF is at currently. So as many of you may know, we received a small forest land grant. That small forest land grant is going to take place in all 3 of the tri-counties here, Deschutes, Jefferson, and Crook County. There was a community selected out of each county that we're going to be doing a fuels reduction grant and a chipping program. So the community that was in Deschutes County is going to be DRH 1 through 5 and 9. So we're going to have roughly about be able to treat about 30 to 40 acres down there with fuels reduction for assistance for landowners that are say elderly or on the lower income or underrepresented is our target for that. And then the chipping program is going to be available to all community members that are within those areas. So we wanted to give you guys an update on that. And then, you know, the landscape resiliency stuff is really starting to get going, especially down or in Deschutes County here. Got quite a bit of work going on and some of our other grants that are taking place.
Great, thanks, Ross. Anybody else with an update they'd like to share? Gary.
Yeah, I just want to talk, since we're talking about grants, we've given out 2 grants so far. We got 2 grants coming before us at our board meeting today, one at Boonesboro and one out east Bonterra Drive. Probably after we encumber those funds for those grants, we'll have about $5,000 left for anybody who wants to apply for one of our wildland fuels grants within the fire district boundaries. Of course, that would have to be completed and receipts into us by June 1st, but I just want to make sure everybody knew that. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Not seeing anybody else off of mute or with a hand up, unless I'm missing y'all. Looks like Patty's got a update in the chat, so we'll capture that for the notes. And yeah, always, I guess a trade-off with the weather. I'd rather have a little bit more snow, but if not, you can be getting some work done. So good to see that's moving forward down in Sun River. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, learned a little bit from it. We'll be sure to capture that PowerPoint if you all want to review that or look over the photos some more. Lots of good insights there. And thanks for joining us all. I think next month we tentatively have ODF on tap to talk about shared stewardship and good neighbor authority, right? Yeah, okay, good neighbor authority, yeah. So with that, hope you all have a great day, and we'll see you back here next month. We are going to shoot for a hybrid meeting next month, so we'll be live in the DeArmond room, hopefully, unless things change, and be offering a virtual option as well, and we'll hope that goes well, and we'll get more details out to you on that here in the near future. All right, thanks again.